The wooden doors of the courtroom loomed before me like gates to a battlefield, their brass handles polished but cold to the touch. When I pushed them open, the hinges groaned as if resenting my return, and the sound carried far beyond what should have been possible. Every head turned, and suddenly the gentle hum of papers, coughs, and whispers evaporated into silence. My shoes struck the marble floor with deliberate rhythm, each step a declaration that I was not there to observe, but to reclaim. I could feel the weight of eyes, dozens of them, locking onto me, questioning who I was, why I was there, and why the air itself seemed heavier with each stride I took toward the heart of the room. I didn't rush. No, that would have stolen the moment from me. Instead, I slowed my pace, savoring the discomfort spreading like wildfire across the faces of those who knew exactly what my presence meant. The lawyer standing tall before the judge stiffened, his sentence snapping in half midair. His lips trembled, his throat bobbing as he leaned toward his client. The room was silent, yet his words carried. Thin, frightened, unmistakable. Is that him? Before we continue, be part of our growing family by hitting that subscribe button. And here's something fun. Share your name and tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments. We might feature you with a shout out in our next video, because your support truly means the world to us. Now, let's proceed. A ripple of gasps spread through the benches as the question hung in the air. The judge's gavel, raised just a second earlier, froze. Even the court reporter's hands stopped moving. I had not yet spoken a word, but already the court belonged to me. It was strange, the power of recognition. Years ago, they thought they had erased me, buried me beneath forged documents and lies so convincing that even the strongest doubters began to accept them as truth. My father had died humiliated, stripped of everything he built, while they celebrated their victory at his expense. I disappeared then, forced into shadows, carrying with me the shame of being the son of a man they called a fraud. They laughed at our name, spat on our reputation, and told the world we had nothing left. And yet, I had waited. I had gathered every scrap of truth they failed to destroy. I had built my life on silence, my days on patience, and now here I was, walking into their fortress with the fire of vengeance burning quietly inside me. The defendant turned his head toward me slowly, as though part of him already knew what he'd see. When our eyes met, the color drained from his face until his skin looked like wax. He tried to disguise the fear with a smirk, but it faltered at the edges, revealing the cracks of guilt underneath. His hands clutched the table as though the polished wood could keep him from drowning. He knew what my presence meant. He knew what I carried under my arm in that black leather folder. For years, he had lived comfortably, believing no one would ever stand in my father's place. And yet, here I was, not just standing, but walking with the certainty that justice had a pulse again. I reached the front rows, my back straight, my eyes unflinching. The whispers of strangers trailed behind me, each one layering the atmosphere with curiosity and unease. "Who is he?" they murmured. "Why is the lawyer frozen?" But I offered them nothing, not an answer, not even a glance. My silence was its own testimony, louder than their chatter. When I reached the plaintiff's table, I stopped. With a steady hand, I laid the folder on the wood, its sound sharp, deliberate, undeniable. The lawyer flinched at the crack, as if the folder itself were a weapon. He wasn't wrong. Inside it lay their undoing, their fraud, their betrayal exposed for all to see. The judge finally found his voice. His tone, however, was not commanding but cautious, as though sensing he was addressing something larger than a mere interruption. "And you are?" he asked, his voice echoing across the chamber. For a moment, I let the question breathe, let the suspense tighten around every chest in the room. I turned my head slowly, my eyes sweeping across the jury, the spectators, and finally locking onto the defendant again. Only then did I speak, my words cutting through the silence like a blade. "I am the son of the man you tried to erase," I said firmly. "The man you drove to his grave with lies. And I am here to finish what he could not." The reaction was instant. A gasp here, a muttered curse there, but mostly it was the collective intake of breath that mattered. The jury leaned forward, curiosity painted across their faces. The defendant swallowed hard, his throat convulsing, his eyes darting between me and the folder as though the very sight of it condemned him. The lawyer's mouth opened as if to object, but no sound came. He looked like a man who had rehearsed every possible scenario, but never this one. The ghost of their past walking in with the truth sharpened and ready to strike. I placed my hand firmly atop the folder and leaned closer to the table. The defendant's eyes widened, his chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. I lowered my voice so only he and the lawyer could hear, though I knew the room was straining to catch every word. "You thought burying my father meant burying me," I whispered. "But you forgot one thing. The dead leave behind sons, and sons remember." His hand shook as he pulled it back from the table, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in a man who once lived untouchable. That fear was the opening chord of the symphony I was about to conduct. The judge, visibly unsettled but holding to procedure, ordered me to explain myself further when proceedings resumed. I nodded without protest, never breaking eye contact with the man who had stolen everything from us. Around us, the courtroom buzzed with renewed whispers, questions piling like waves against the walls. Who was I? What did I carry? Why had the lawyer, so sure of himself minutes ago, now shrunk into silence? They would all know soon enough. This was just the opening act. My entrance was only the beginning. The gavel struck hard, commanding the room back to order, but even the sharp crack could not erase the tension I had ignited. The judge's voice was steady, though I caught the slight hesitation when he repeated his demand. "State your purpose clearly." I could feel the jury's eyes drilling into me, curiosity rising like a tide. Slowly, I opened the leather folder, letting the hinges creak as though it carried centuries of weight. Papers rustled, and the sound alone was enough to make the lawyer shift uneasily in his seat. He knew what was coming. He just didn't know how devastating it would be. The first document I placed on the table was a signed receipt with my father's unmistakable signature. Not a forgery, not a fabrication. The real thing, untouched, preserved for years in places they never thought to look. "This," I said, my voice cutting through the hush of the room, "is the receipt they claimed did not exist. The proof they swore was destroyed." Gasps rose from the benches, and even the court reporter's fingers trembled on the keys. The defendant's jaw tightened, his lips pressed into a thin line as his eyes darted nervously toward the jury. He was cornered, and he knew it. But I didn't stop there. I laid down the next set of papers, bank statements, neatly arranged, showing the flow of money that had been hidden with such precision. I traced the columns with my finger, pointing out the trail they had tried to bury under shell accounts and falsified ledgers. "For years, they told you my father squandered his funds." I continued, my tone calm yet burning with restrained fury. "But here is where the money went, straight into accounts tied to the defendant, concealed under layers of deception." The jurors leaned in, their eyes widening as the undeniable truth stared back at them in ink and numbers. The lawyer, sweating now, rose to his feet and sputtered something about inadmissible evidence and ambush tactics, but his voice faltered under the sheer weight of what was unfolding. The judge silenced him with a stern glare, gesturing for me to proceed. I took out the final set of papers, letters, handwritten, stained slightly with age, yet perfectly legible. I held one up high enough for the jury to see before lowering it gently onto the table. "These are letters exchanged between the defendant and his partners, plotting how to dismantle my father's reputation," I said firmly. They laughed about it in ink. They thought no one would ever uncover their words. I looked directly at the defendant as I spoke, savoring the tremor in his hands as he tried to steady himself. "Do you remember this line?" I asked, tapping one of the letters. "He'll be gone soon, and no one will stand for him." The silence that followed was suffocating. The jury's eyes shot back to the defendant, searching his face for denial, but he offered none. His shoulders slumped slightly, and the weight of exposure pressed down on him like a mountain. Every secret he buried was now rising to the surface, and I was the one delivering them to daylight. Yet, documents and numbers were only part of the truth. Revenge, I knew, required more than evidence. It required memory, raw, undeniable, personal. I turned to the jury, my voice steady but heavy with grief and anger. I watched my father die with these lies choking the last of his spirit, I said. They stripped him of his name, his dignity, and his work, parading their false victory as if it were justice. He was mocked in this very community, and I was forced to live in silence, carrying the shame they manufactured. But shame is a fragile thing. It crumbles when the truth is revealed. The lawyer attempted another objection, but his words were drowned out by the shifting of bodies in the gallery, people whispering, reacting, weighing the evidence they had just seen. The judge pounded his gavel again, but even he could not disguise the storm that had broken loose in the courtroom. The atmosphere had transformed from routine proceedings into something else entirely, a reckoning. And in that reckoning, I stood as the embodiment of every truth they thought buried. I gathered the documents back into the folder, but I did not close it. Instead, I placed my palm over the stack, anchoring them in place as I leaned slightly forward. My eyes locked with the defendant's, his face pale and drawn. "You believed you had silenced us forever," I whispered, my tone low but heavy with conviction. "But you forgot that lies rot from the inside. And now, the rot is spilling out for everyone to see." He shifted uncomfortably, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as though it might keep him from falling apart in front of the world. The judge finally called for recess, perhaps sensing that the room needed air before it imploded. The gavel struck once more, sharp and decisive, but the spell of silence lingered even as people began to stir. Jurors exchanged wary glances, spectators whispered furiously, and the lawyer collapsed back into his chair like a man already defeated. The defendant refused to meet my gaze, staring at the table instead, his bravado crumbling piece by piece. My evidence had struck harder than any weapon could. And yet, this was only the middle of the story. The true collapse, the one that would bury them as they buried my father, was yet to come. The courtroom buzzed when recess was called, but the air didn't loosen, it thickened. The gavel may have struck, but the truth I had unleashed lingered like smoke in the lungs of everyone present. Jurors whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward me, toward the defendant, and back again. Spectators leaned in, their murmurs carrying questions that had no easy answers. The lawyer collapsed into his chair, wiping sweat from his brow, his confidence shredded to tatters. The defendant sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly that a vein pulsed violently at his temple. I remained standing, unflinching, letting the weight of silence press down on him until his composure fractured in front of all who watched. The lawyer leaned closer to his client, whispering urgently, but I could see from the defendant's eyes that the words brought him no comfort. His shoulders twitched, his breath uneven, his hand tapping nervously against the wood of the table. He avoided looking at me, but when his eyes did accidentally flick in my direction, they darted away like a man staring into the sun. That small gesture was enough. The jury noticed it, the spectators noticed it, and I certainly noticed it. Fear was his confession, and in a courtroom, fear often shouted louder than any denial. I remained where I stood, a shadow over their carefully crafted narrative, watching as their fortress crumbled from within. For years, they had lived comfortably, building their empires on the ashes of my father's name. They had laughed in their circles, spoken boldly in their papers, and signed documents dripping with false authority. But here, now, stripped of control, they sat cornered, like rats caught in daylight. I didn't need to scream or pound the table. The silence I carried into that room had already done its work. The courtroom, once theirs, was now mine. The whispers in the gallery grew, rising like an approaching tide. People no longer asked who I was. They spoke my name with awe, some with guilt for ever believing the lies, others with admiration for my audacity to return. "That's him," I heard a man mutter, his voice laced with disbelief. "That's the son." Another leaned toward his neighbor and said, "They tried to erase him. And here he is." Each whisper chipped further at the defendant's armor, until the sweat rolling down his temples revealed the truth of his unraveling. The judge, though outwardly composed, stole glances at me with a mix of caution and curiosity. He knew the case had shifted, perhaps irrevocably, and that his role was no longer to preside over routine proceedings, but to contain an unfolding storm. The gavel would not save the lawyer now. Objections would not resurrect their credibility. What I had placed on the table was not merely evidence. It was a reckoning. And the jury, sworn to seek truth, had seen it with their own eyes. No amount of polished rhetoric could scrub away the ink on those documents, nor the tremor in the defendant's hands. During the recess, the lawyer attempted to approach me, his lips pressed into a thin, desperate smile. His words came in whispers, each one soaked in pleading. "Perhaps we can discuss this outside," he muttered, eyes darting nervously to ensure no one overheard. "There's no need to drag this further. We can come to an arrangement." His voice cracked at the word arrangement, as though even he knew how pathetic it sounded. I leaned closer, my voice low but sharp enough to slice through his trembling. "The time for arrangements ended the day you buried my father's honor," I told him. "This isn't negotiation. This is truth clawing its way back from the grave." His face collapsed into defeat, and he stepped back without another word. The defendant remained in his seat, his eyes fixed on the table, as though refusing to look up might keep the world from collapsing around him. But nothing could stop the collapse. It had already begun. His silence was no longer strength. It was weakness, obvious to all. The jury had seen the way his hands shook, the way his lawyer faltered, the way I stood unbroken before them. And when the recess ended, that image would not vanish from their minds. It would harden into certainty. As the minutes ticked down, I felt the weight of years lifting from my shoulders. My father's voice echoed in my memory, not the broken voice of his final days, but the strong, resolute tone he carried before betrayal stole everything from him. I carried that voice with me, every step I took, every word I spoke, until now, when it finally found its echo in this courtroom. This wasn't just about vengeance. It was about restoring the dignity of a man they thought forgotten. And through me, he stood again. When the bailiff called everyone back into the room, the transformation was undeniable. The jury entered with firm expressions, their eyes sharper, their postures straighter. The spectators hushed quickly, the anticipation thrumming like a taut string ready to snap. The judge adjusted his glasses, but the weight in his voice betrayed the gravity of what was unfolding. "Court is now back in session," he announced. His words echoed, but it was the silence afterward that mattered most. Every breath in the room seemed to wait for me. I did not speak again that day. I didn't need to. My entrance had pierced their confidence. My evidence had gutted their defense. And now, their silence was their verdict, long before the jury would deliver it. When the judge looked at me, there was no dismissal in his eyes, only acknowledgement. He knew, as did everyone else in that room, that the case had already shifted, that the truth had returned, and that the defendant's fall was inevitable. As the session adjourned, I turned toward the doors once more. This time, there was no hesitation in my stride. People parted as I passed, their eyes following me, their whispers turning to words of respect, awe, and disbelief. The lawyer slumped further into his chair, his head bowed in defeat. The defendant still refused to look at me, but I didn't need his gaze. His silence was louder than any confrontation. I had done what I came to do. I had taken back what was stolen, not in wealth, but in truth. The heavy doors closed behind me with a resounding thud, sealing the chapter they had written with lies and opening the one I had written with justice. For years, they thought my father's story ended with disgrace. But today, as I walked away from the courtroom, I knew the truth. His honor lived again, his son had returned, and their empire of deceit was collapsing brick by brick. And as for me, I didn't need their applause. The silence of their downfall was all the victory I ever sought. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us.